Yes, that's right. Just as the title of the video says, King Irmin, the king of Khaenri'ah, is the Primordial One. Okay, listen, trust me. I know how ridiculously stupid this statement sounds, but yeah, it is stupid. I'm not even gonna pretend to defend it. And this is coming from a guy who has a history of making extremely out-of-pocket theories. So when someone like me says that a theory is stupid, you know it is stupid. But here's the problem. It works. This crazy nonsensical idea somehow freaking works. And I've been losing my mind over it for the past 2 months. Dude, I don't even know what to say in the intro for a video like this. Why does it make sense? Hey, you know what? Screw the intro. Let's just get right into the juicy part. So, as always in my videos, we will begin with the most unlikely starting point imaginable. The Horror of Babylon. And now, I completely understand how outlandish it is for me to suggest that Irmin is the Primordial One. Because of that, my goal in this video won't be to try and convince you of this theory. Rather, I will present you the logic behind it step by step, and then you can decide what to do with that information. And as you will see throughout this video, there are so many hints and clues and so many dots that connect to each other to the point where even if I am wrong, there has to be something to it. There must be some truth to this theory. This cannot be a coincidence. Get ready, because out of every video I have released on this channel, this is going to be the wildest one I have ever made to date. First and foremost, in case you are unfamiliar with Irmin, the most important thing you need to know about him is that he was the last king of Khaenri'ah, which presumably makes him a member of the Eclipse dynasty. Notably, Irmin was a great proponent of forbidden knowledge, heavily promoting its usage for the betterment of his kingdom, much to the dismay of several of his advisors and courtiers, one of whom later joined the Tsaritsa as the first Fetuwis Pieru. Nonetheless, the Khaenri'ahns managed to utilize forbidden knowledge to great effect, with alchemists such as Rheindotter using it for her research and other engineers implementing it in their machinery, allowing the nation to develop and advance at an astronomical rate, all culminating in Irmin and the Khaenri'ahn sages tearing away the veil of sin, which ultimately led to the cataclysm that swept away their kingdom. Somewhere in between those two events, Irmin became indisposed for reasons yet to be revealed, rendering him incapable of ruling Khaenri'ah, after which the leader of the Swan Knights Anfortas Elbrek took the responsibility of the kingdom. And that is pretty much all you need to know, for now at least. There is obviously more that we're going to talk about later. And here, some of you might be asking a very reasonable question. Just how could this human king who lived around 510 years ago be the Primordial One, the king of the gods that presumably oversaw the destruction of the kingdom of Khaenri'ah? Well, hold on to that thought. I will get back to it later. But first, as I mentioned earlier, I want to walk you through how I got to this point to begin with. You see, I have had this idea that Irmin could be the king depicted in the Gnostic chorus of the Battle Pass at the back of my mind for a while now, since September of 2022 to be exact. But notice how I say could, not is, because in reality, this king might be either Irmin or Nibelung, or even a representation of the original god, the Gnostic monad, also known as the One. But I am currently inclined to say that he is Irmin. You're about to see why this all works well together. In fact, ironically, the reason it works is exactly why I have been sitting on this theory for such a long time. It is because I was missing it. I was missing that one final piece to the puzzle, but I just could not find it. And then it found me, because a short while ago I was finishing some work, and in the background I was listening to a psychologist analyzing a rap song out of all things, when the topic of the Horror of Babylon was brought up. And that is when everything clicked to me. So here we are. This video will be divided into several parts for the sake of simplicity. Timestamps and spoiler warnings are in the description, and alright, get ready, because this is going to be a wild, wild one. Let's go. When I mentioned the Horror of Babylon in the context of Genshin Impact, I am referring to a specific part of the New Testament known as the Apocalypse of John, which was written by John the son of Zebedee, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, where in Genshin, John would correspond to Colombina. Or perhaps maybe Piero, but probably Colombina. Look, don't worry about this now, I'm gonna explain it towards the end of this video. The Apocalypse of John is more commonly known as the Book of Revelations, and the section we are interested in is Revelation 17, 1-8, where John recounts a vision he had. Now, I'm gonna read it out to you first, and then we're gonna go through it through the lens of Genshin Impact to see how it applies to the story. And it reads as follows. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters. with whom the kings of the earth committed sexual immorality, and earth's inhabitants were made drunk with the wine of her sexual immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery: Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Okay, to start things off, the most important thing we need to establish is the identity of the angel that guides John through the vision. Also, ladies and gentlemen, to reiterate, I am looking at this through the lens of Genshin Impact. In the passage, John describes the angel as one of the 7 who had the 7 bowls, where the bowls in the Bible represent the judgment of God upon those who oppose him, the followers of Lucifer, let us say. Here, it should be evident that the 7 bowls represent the 7 authorities. But the real question is, who are the 7 angels? Do they correspond to the 7 archons or the 7 dragon sovereigns? And, well, I already gave you the answer, actually. Remember that the 7 authorities, or bowls, represent the judgment of God upon the sinners, the followers of Lucifer, who was an archangel that tried to rebel against God. Those amongst the angels who closely follow him were likewise cast down from heaven, becoming fallen angels, becoming demons. This is perfect because the gods of Teyvat, which I have consistently equated with hell throughout my previous videos, are each and all named after the 72 demons of the Lesser Key of Solomon, the Ars Goetia. To support this, one of the shades of the Primordial One, who in this case is Lucifer, is known as Istaroth, which is derived from the Ars Goetia demon Astaroth, while Nuvelat in his voice lines refers to Nibilang as the Heavenly Father, which is a title that belongs to God. Moreover, in Chinese, the archons are referred to as demon gods anyway, meaning that the 7 angels in this context are almost definitely the 7 dragon sovereigns, the archangels of the Heavenly Father, Nibilang. The angel then tells John, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed sexual immorality." And this line is very interesting. First of all, this great prostitute does not necessarily refer to a singular entity. Rather, it could potentially mean an institution like a kingdom or a nation or an organization of some sort. However, in the context of Genshin, I would argue that the great prostitute who sits on many waters is both an institution and a person. The angel calls her the great prostitute who sits on many waters. Here, don't be fooled into thinking that it is Egeria, the mistress of many waters, because that is not who I am talking about. Let me explain. John says that the great prostitute is the one whom all the kings of the earth committed sexual immorality with, and all the people were made drunk with her wine. Keep in mind that sexual immorality is a metaphor for sin, any type of sin, not just adultery and whatnot. This makes the great prostitute the essence of disinhibited sin. And what does it mean when it says she sits on many waters? Well, water in the biblical account is a symbol of chaos, and so underneath disinhibited sin is chaos itself, the chaos that devours everything. And in Genshin, forbidden knowledge is a symbol of sin against the heavenly principles. It is knowledge from beyond the false sky. It is knowledge from beyond Teyvat. And underneath that forbidden knowledge is the abyss that devoured the civilizations of King Deshret and King Irmin when they tore the veil of sin to obtain it. John then describes how the prostitute mounts a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names with 7 heads and 10 horns. Here, the color scarlet, or red, signifies the power of the Primordial One. I've already gone over this topic in one of my previous videos, so I will leave a link to it in the description if you are interested. But in Genshin, red essentially boils down to the power of the alchemical rubidu, the power of the philosopher's stone to transmute base metals into gold or silver and grant immortality. Now notice the appearance of the prostitute, and pay attention because this is actually important. She wears garments of purple and scarlet, which are traditionally associated with royalty, and she is adorned with gold, jewelry, and pearls while holding a golden cup. Keep this imagery in mind. As I mentioned earlier, the great prostitute in Genshin likely carries a dual interpretation, symbolizing both a single individual and an institution. Later, it is revealed that the name of the great prostitute is Babylon, the great mother of sin and all of Earth's abominations. Many of you should be already familiar with Babylon, as it is an ancient city of great historical significance found in modern-day Iraq. And in biblical accounts, Babylon was a city founded following the deluge by Noah's great-grandson Nimrod, where a unified human civilization once lived, speaking a single language. Over time, the humans became arrogant and decided to construct the Tower of Babel to reach the heavens. However, God disapproved of their pride and ambition, so he confused their tongues until the barrier in their language formed divisions amongst them and they were scattered across the earth. This story is very much reminiscent of the first unified civilization which the Byakuya belonged to, but it should also remind you of another civilization, Khaenri'ah. After all, remember what Clothar Elbrick says during the Caribert Conquest. Although Khaenri'ah began with a single bloodline, it welcomed people from all corners of the world, meaning that Khaenri'ah is also an example of a unified nation akin to the likes of Babylon and the first civilization. At the end of the day, the Khaenri'ahns chose to tear the veil of sin and suffered for their mortal arrogations. They also built their own tower towards the heavens, the Spiral Abyss. Whenever you go to talk to Catherine at the Adventurers Guild, she greets you with the phrase Ad Astra Abyssast, which translates to the stars and the abyss. Now notice how the deeper you descend into the Spiral Abyss, the closer you get to the moon. And by the time you get to floor 12, you bypass the moon entirely and reach space. And this is very interesting because the shiny starry sky is commonly associated with divine imagery. In fact, I would argue that there is nothing closer to divinity than the visage of the night sky illuminated by the stars and the moon like jewels on a canvas embodying the essence of hope, majesty, and unlimited potential. It is that light which humanity gazed upon and always sought to reach. But this is where things get very tricky, because this heavenly image is that of the abyss. And if the abyss is in reality the heavens, then that begs the question. While narrating the Gnostic chorus, Barbatos talks about a kingdom once established amongst the heavens. So is the kingdom established amongst the heavens Celestia? Or is it Khaenri'ah? Well, what if I told you, and I bet most of you won't expect this answer, that it does not matter, because both of them are essentially the same thing. Keep what I said in mind, we're gonna come back to it later because baby, we are just getting started. Anyway, before I get too ahead of myself, I did say that the Great Prostitute in Genshin is both an institution and a person. Going back to John's description, she is said to be the mother of prostitutes, which basically means the mother of sin, and of all Earth's abominations. What a nice coincidence, because as it so happens, we have a character in Genshin that perfectly matches that description. Towards the end of the story quest's troublesome work, the Traveler and Lisa retrieve the first volume out of 7 of a book stolen by the Abyss Order known as The Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies. And the opening line of that series talks about the Night Mother, who rules the distant land of Night. The Night Mother is then immediately identified as the source of all sin and the vile creatures of the night. Therefore, there should be no room for contention regarding the fact that the whore of Babylon is the Night Mother. But hold on, there is more, because I'm going to tell you exactly who the Night Mother is. In the year 1924, a Syrian dealer acquired a terracotta plate that he found while traveling in southern Iraq. The piece was later deposited at the British Museum in London. However, the museum declined to purchase it, after which it was passed to a British antique dealer by the name of Sidney Burney. 79 years later, the plate was returned to the British Museum, where it was identified to belong to the Old Babylonian period, possibly originating from the city-state of Larsha in ancient Sumer, which is a region that encompassed the city of Babylon. The plaque was dubbed as the Queen of the Night for its depiction of one of the two sister goddesses, either Ereshkigal, the Queen of the Underworld, or Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. But here's the catch. It doesn't matter which of the two sisters is the Queen of the Night, because both Ereshkigal and Ishtar fit perfectly within the framework of Khaenri'ah. You see, in Sumerian mythology, Ereshkigal was the Queen of the Underworld and the patron deity of the dead. Now, putting aside the fact that Khaenri'ah is infamous for being an underground nation, Teyvat itself is also associated with the underworld, since the gods who rule it are all named after the 72 demons of the Lesser Key of Solomon. And speaking of demons, the name of Ereshkigal's sister Ishtar is used by Hoyoverse's writers in tandem with the Ars Goetia demon Astaroth to form the name of one of the shades of the Primordial One. the god of time, Ishtaroth. And look, I know some of you might be confused right now because this video is supposed to be about King Irmin, yet somehow I've been talking for over 10 minutes about prostitutes, along with Syria, Iraq, and a bunch of Mesopotamian gods. But bear with me, I promise you, this is going somewhere, you will see. In Babylon, Ishtar was the goddess of love, sex, fertility, war, and beauty, and most importantly for this video, she was also the goddess of divine law and political power. And through her name, we can connect the Genshin demon god Ishtaroth with the divine will. But what is interesting is that Ishtar's symbol was the 8-pointed star. In fact, the 8-pointed star is called the Star of Ishtar. This is why it is associated with Venus, which is the Roman name for the goddess of sexual love and beauty, Aphrodite, who is, surprise, surprise, the direct Greek equivalent to Ishtar. On top of that, the other half of Ishtaroth's name, the demon Astaroth, serves as proof that all of the gods of Celestia, including the highest ranking ones, are named after the 72 demons that God subjugated to King Solomon. And the 8-pointed star, the symbol of Ishtar, is also the symbol of the Khaenri'ahns, as it can be found on the clothes of Clothar, the armor of the Black Serpent Knights, and on the gates leading into the nation beneath the Temir Mountains in Sumeru. So, could this possibly mean that Ishtaroth was the god of Khaenri'ah? Well, no. After all, Khaenri'ah was a nation with no gods. But what it does tell us is that Ishtaroth originated from Khaenri'ah. And this is the point that I've been building up to. Recall that Ishtar was the Babylonian goddess of sex and love, which by proxy associates her with the whore of Babylon, since that one is called the great mother of prostitutes and of all of Earth's abominations, making the whore of Babylon the mother of sin, the night mother. However, despite all of that, and even though Khaenri'ah is Genshin's Babylon, it is legitimately impossible for Ishtaroth to be the Night Mother, because we already know that she is one of the 4 shades of the king. Furthermore, we have already seen the Night Mother, and those of you familiar with my channel know exactly who I am talking about. The Gnostic chorus of Genshin's Battle Pass is directly inspired by a Syriac poem known as the Hymn of the Pearl, which was allegedly sung by Thomas the Apostle during his imprisonment. In the poem, the King of Kings sends his second heir to retrieve a precious pearl that was stolen by a serpent residing at the bottom of the sea in Egypt. However, on his journey, the boy is deceived by the Egyptians. They make him eat their food and wear their clothes until he forgets the memories of his noble origins and ends up serving their king. The boy then metaphorically falls into a deep sleep until his parents and brother send him a letter to remind him of his mission. Genshin's Gnostic chorus follows this story closely, with only a few minor differences, such as the second heir being a princess rather than a prince. But what I want you to focus on is the depiction of the princess. She wears royal garments decorated with golden jewelry and is seated on a throne engulfed with scarlet, while holding a golden cup with a glowing scarlet liquid in it. Furthermore, the snake that stole her father's pearl is heterochromatic, with one eye being purple and the other eye being crimson red. As you might have noticed, this description perfectly matches that of the whore of Babylon, who sits on a scarlet beast adorned with jewelry and expensive scarlet and purple cloth, while holding a golden cup full of the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. And earlier in this video, I talked about how this crimson red power surrounding the snake and in the princess's cup is the power of the alchemical rubido, one of the 4 stages of Western alchemy, and widely regarded as the magnum opus, and it is the production of the philosopher's stone, the power to manipulate fate and grant immortality. But what we really care about is the fact that the cup of the great prostitute made her drunk with the blood of the saints and the martyrs, and one of the primary ingredients for the creation of the Philosopher's Stone in several works of fiction is human life or human souls. And if we take a look at the crimson red souls found in the subspace of the Fantastic Compass in the Chasm, Genshin appears to follow that theme as well. All this to say that the second heir to the King of Kings, the one whom Barbatos dubs as the Queen of the Kingdom of Darkness, is the Night Mother. And the mother of sin is the whore of Babylon. And Babylon is Khaenri'ah, a kingdom built in the underworld. And the Babylonian queen of the underworld was not Ishtar, but rather her sister, Ereshkigal, the Queen of the Night. As a matter of fact, I will go a step further. Not only am I going to claim in this video that the human King Irmin is the Primordial One, but the Night Mother and the god of time Ishtaroth are also humans. Nay, The rulers of Celestia, all of them are humans from Khaenri'ah. How, you might ask? Well, to answer that, let me tell you about a story called The Legend of Saha. On the 30th of August 2023, I made a lore video discussing Teyvat's cyclical nature where I introduced a flash game known as The Legend of Saha. And to my surprise, I've gotten hundreds of comments since then from people telling me that they have never heard about that game before. And since then, I have made it my mission to make that game as well known as possible. In case this is also your first time hearing about it, then oh boy, get ready because you're in for a treat. You see, The Legend of Saha is Genshin Impact. And I don't mean that in the sense of Genshin is heavily inspired by it, no. The Legend of Saha is Genshin. The Legend of Saha was a flash game developed in 2009 by HoYoverse's back then MiHoYo's CEO and chairman, Saihao Yu, approximately 3 years before he founded the company with Liu Wei. So in a sense, The Legend of Saha is really the genesis of MiHoYo. It is their first ever game from which all of their other stories are derived. And I don't say this lightly. The Legend of Saha is the cornerstone of MiHoYo's storytelling. Virtually every major character in HoYoverse's IPs can be traced back to some extent to The Legend of Saha, either from a direct character in that game or from one of the many scrap characters that never made it to the final release. And as it so happens to be, the very man who made The Legend of Saha back when he was a broke college student, Saihao Yu, has now become the 73rd wealthiest man in China, better known today as the lead producer of Genshin Impact. And as you're about to see, his philosophy and vision have carried over perfectly into Genshin. But before I begin, I must let you guys know about this Reddit thread written by Babao Tree, as it acts as a compilation of various extremely interesting connections between The Legend of Saha and the rest of HoYoverse's games, especially Genshin. The video I talked about earlier regarding Teyvat's cycle of destruction would not exist today without this Reddit thread, and the overwhelming positive feedback that that video generated is the reason I decided to continue making lore videos. Therefore, this channel owes a lot to that thread, so check it out if you are interested. With that being said, neither that Reddit thread nor this video are going to cover all that there is to say about The Legend of Saha and Genshin Impact. There is going to be a lot more to discuss, which is why I'll be making a separate video in the future dedicated to doing just that. For now, I'm going to summarize the game and focus on the details relevant to King Irmin and the Night Mother. And the gist of it goes as follows. The game begins with Missy Nanatsuki waking up on Mount Sumeru missing her memories, which were scattered across the world along with pieces of her soul. Nana then embarks on a journey to retrieve those fragments and restore her power. And towards the end of her journey, she reaches the Divine Realm, only to find that it was empty ruins and the supposed gods in it were an illusion. While the true heavenly realm, where the real gods reside, lies beyond the sky itself. After regaining the final piece of her memories at the end of the game, Nana remembers the truth. Long before waking up on Mount Sumeru, Nana was once an orphan adopted by the High Priest of Nalan, which in Genshin is Natlan, and eventually became a saint or a holy maiden depending on the translation. One day, the king of an opposing nation decided to launch a great crusade to conquer the land of Nalan and annihilate its people. The holy maiden Nana then sacrificed herself so that she may reach the divine realm and be granted an audience with the gods. Yet when confronted with the holy ones, they refuse. Nana then discovers that despite their divinity, the gods were once humans, and thus their hearts were susceptible to sin and mortal desires. And the way they harness their power is by granting the wishes of the people and fulfilling their ambitions. Therefore, it was more beneficial for the gods to allow for the genocide of Nalan, thereby granting the wishes of the invading army, who would then honor them with feasts, prayers, and sacrifices, than to grant the wish of a single lonely girl. Despite Nana's cries and pleas, the gods laugh at her and mock her. The king of the gods then shatters her soul into several fragments and discards her into the earth, with her final moments witnessing the people of her nation being put to the sword. Nana then wakes up on Mount Sumeru, this time remembering her past. Her purpose clear, she vows to get revenge on the gods and embarks on a journey to the divine realm. However, when Nana finally reaches the king of the gods once more, she discovers a horrifying truth. the gods had bound themselves to the fabric of the world, and to kill them, she would first have to kill every living soul. Regardless of the choice which the player makes, Nana then fails and is reborn again on Mount Sumeru, and again, and again, and again in an endless pagoda, never being able to save her people, never being able to kill the gods. Now, obviously I'm making it sound way cooler than it actually was. After all, remember this was a half-baked Flash game made in 2009 with pixelated chibi models and really buggy gameplay. But I think you understand the point I'm trying to make. Putting aside the blatant similarities between the two games, the most important takeaway that I want you to have is that the Gods of Saha, before they became gods, were originally humans. And while that doesn't sound enough to prove that the King of Khaenri'ah, Irmin, is the Primordial One, remember that I have spent over 10 minutes talking about the Whore of Babylon, the Night Mother. I did that for a reason. You're gonna see why. While exploring Enkanomiya, the Traveler and Paimon go through a magical mirror that sends them into a hidden library where they find a book called Before Sun and Moon, which is akin to a dramatized historical account written by the scribe of Istaroth, one of the four shades of the Primordial One. The book tells of how the King of the Gods, the Primordial One, came and challenged the 7 terrifying sovereigns of the old world, then, in decisive victory, arrested their authorities, leading to the creation of Teyvat and its inhabitants. The story is written in a manner heavily reminiscent to the story of Noah from the Bible, and as I mentioned earlier, according to the Bible, the city of Babylon, which in Genshin is Khaenri'ah, was founded by Noah's great-grandson, Nimrod. And by the way, fun fact, if you remove the O and the D, Nimrod has all the letters you need to form the name Irmin. But that's not really important right now. What we care about is the allegory found later in the book, known as the Parable of the Tree. Now, the Parable of the Tree is taken directly from a set of alchemical texts known as Splendor Solis, which means the splendor of the sun, written by a legendary alchemist known as Shalamon Trismosin. And yes, the name Shalamon, which is Solomon, will be important later. We are specifically interested in plate number 6 of the Splendor Solis, which depicts a young boy climbing a tree with 2 philosophers conversing underneath it. Shalamon Trismosin based this parable on the Roman myth of Aeneas and Sibyl. By the way, Aeneas is a very prominent Greek mythological figure who happens to be the son of Aphrodite, who we earlier said was the Greek equivalent of the goddess Ishtar. Aeneas is also the ancestor of Remus and King Arthur, and as you know, those two names play a huge role in the stories of Fontaine and Mondstadt respectively. I'm not going anywhere with this, just letting you know in case it's relevant in the future. Anyway, in Virgil's Aeneid, Aeneas is determined to go to the underworld to seek guidance from his deceased father and learn about the future destiny of Rome. So Aeneas travels to the temple of Apollo to speak with the prophetess known as the Cumaean Sibyl. She tells him that by the entrance of the underworld grows a sacred silver tree which has golden branches, and whenever a branch from that tree was broken, another would grow in its place. She then tells him that the tree has a golden bough which allows one passage into the underworld, and if the fates allow for it, then one can break the bough and visit the underworld. Otherwise, the main branch would be impossible to remove. From an alchemical point of view, since at the end of the day, the Parable of the Tree is taken from alchemy, the most important feature to point out is the crown at the base of the tree's trunk, as it serves to highlight the fact that the tree is not just that which we see with our own eyes, because that which is unseen is equally important, since the roots of the tree create their own complex system beneath the earth. Therefore, the tree acts as an axis mundi, which means cosmic axis, more on that later, connecting the heavens with the underworld, while replicating itself as above, so below. These roots are Teyvat's ley lines, which play a crucial role in the overall functions of Irminsul. Now in Genshin, the Parable of the Tree tells of a royal gardener and a tree fairy of the royal garden who loved each other very, very much. However, one day the king ordered the gardener to cut down the tree to repair the beams of his pavilion. And the king was the incarnation of the Primordial One. Thus, the poor gardener could not defy the sovereign of sovereigns, so he took to the king's priest, who was the incarnation of the god of time, Istaroth. The priest felt pity for the young man and instructed him to cut the branches of the tree first, then do as the king ordered and cut the tree itself down. The gardener did as he was told. Then the priest told him to plant the branches in the ground. The gardener felt sorrow, for the tree spirit would take 500 years to grow. but the priest Istaroth, who could take the seeds of any moment into the past and future, reassured him that this moment shall echo through eternity, as the branches grew instantly into a new tree, and the fairy of that tree was the continuation of the previous one. As many of you know, the parable of the tree was used to foreshadow the events of Beelzebul's second story quest, where she plants her sister Baal as a seed 500 years in the future that grows into the sacred Sakura tree 1000 years in the past. And it's really good writing on Hoyoverse's part. However, we can also apply this parable in a different context, which gives us a very interesting perspective. Recall that the parable of the tree in Genshin is inspired by the 6th plate from Shalamon Trismosin's alchemical texts, The Splendor of the Sun, which in Genshin is inspired by a poem written by the Roman poet Publius Vergilius Maro. Now, I know that there are some stuff going on the sides of the plate, however, let us focus on the main central painting. The tree in Genshin would of course be Irminsul, that much is obvious, which means that the tree fairy would be Boer. Now, whether it is Rukkhadevata or Kusanali is not that important, it's essentially the same thing. Anyway, when it comes to the young lad who is climbing the tree, he is notably wearing black, which is the color of the prima materia, the primal matter that makes up Nigredo, the first stage in the alchemical magnum opus. Here, remember that the sacred tree in Virgil's poem had a great golden bough that provided passage into the underworld, which can be interpreted as both the abyss and Khaenri'ah, meaning that the tree is the axis mundi connecting the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. And in Genshin, we happen to have a certain Khaenri'ahn bowkeeper whose predominant color scheme is black. The Twilight Sword of Khaenri'ah, Dainsleif. Also, to add further proof to what I just said, Dainsleif as a character has a lot in common with the Hindu god Vishnu, specifically with his avatar, Narayana. I made a whole video talking about that if you are interested, but essentially, in his avatar Narayana, Vishnu sleeps on the serpent king Shesha, while his wife Lakshmi can be found on his side massaging his feet. Lakshmi is the Hindu goddess of Maya, and Nahida's elemental burst summons the shrine of Maya. So yeah, they've got that going on too. Okay. Knowing who the gardener and the tree fairy are, we're left with 2 philosophers to identify, which is very convenient since the only 2 other characters in the parable of the tree are the Primordial One and his shade Istaroth, and there is actually a way to identify precisely who is who. Since Istaroth is one of the shades of the Primordial One, the 2 would logically possess similar types of power. Here, notice how one of the philosophers is wearing a lot of white with a little bit of red, while the other wears a lot of red with a little bit of white. The predominantly red one should be the king, since the red is Rubidu, the power of the Philosopher's Stone obtained after achieving the alchemical magnum opus. The same type of power you see surrounding the Black Serpent and the Night Mother in the Gnostic Chorus. This leaves the philosopher pointing at the tree as Istaroth. Oh, and by the way, the hawk at the top of the tree should be Vidrfolnir. In case you don't remember him, he is the visionary that Skirk mentions while name-dropping Sertology. That being said, before I continue, we need to address the herd of elephants in the savannah. Irminsul shares the exact same name with the king of Khaenri'ah, Irmin, and that is kind of a big deal. We know that Irmin was the last king of Khaenri'ah a little over 500 years ago, and based on the fact that Khaenri'ah was a human kingdom that did not acknowledge any gods, then their king Irmin should have been a human as well. On the other hand, we know that the avatar of Irminsul, Rukkhadevata, is way older than 500 years, making it impossible for the tree to be named after the king. Therefore, the only assumption left would be that the King Irmin was named after the tree. However, that is not the case. The name Irmin, and by extension Irminsul, are Anglo-Saxon words, and the Anglo-Saxons were a Germanic people. Now, based on their naming conventions along with their cultural and mythological inspirations, the nation of Khaenri'ah is based on the Nordic people of Scandinavia. And while they are not identical, both Germanic and Nordic people share a lot in common. Irminsul translates directly to the Great Pillar, where it is equated with the axis mundi of Norse mythology, the world tree Yggdrasil, which connects the 9 realms. And interestingly enough, Irmin happens to be the Germanic equivalent of one of the most important deities in Norse mythology, the All-Father Odin, who hung himself from Yggdrasil to obtain wisdom and knowledge of the magical arts. This goes in tandem with how King Irmin sought forbidden knowledge from the abyss and went as far as to tear the veil of sin to obtain it. So if Irminsul is Genshin's Yggdrasil and Teyvat's Axis Mundi, then Irminsul would be Odin's tree, and since Irmin is the All-Father Odin, Rukkhadevata would be Irmin's tree. But once again, that is a major problem, because how the heck would Irmin be the owner of Irminsul, or the one responsible for its creation, when Irminsul is thousands of years older than he is? And there is an answer to that, and it has to do with Rubidoux, because aside from red being the color of the Philosopher's Stone, it is also the color of blood. And do you remember earlier when I told you how the gods in the Legend of Saha used to be humans? Well, we happen to be interested in a very specific group of humans, the Khaenri'ahn royal bloodline of the Eclipse dynasty. We know that Dainsleif is the Bowkeeper, with the Bow being the main branch of Irminsul, which once again represents Yggdrasil, the axis mundi that connects the 9 realms. Now, on his quest to obtain knowledge, Odin stabbed himself with a spear and hung himself from Yggdrasil, which can be interpreted as a form of death. Yes, I know that he didn't actually die, but we're talking symbolically here. And speaking of death, in Virgil's Aeneid, which inspires Shalamon Trismos' Splendor Solis, and thus also inspires the parable of the tree by proxy, the sacred tree had a golden bough that allowed passage into the underworld, the realm of Hades, which in Genshin is the abyss. And based on the crimson red sky which the travelers saw, we know that Irminsul is found in Khaenri'ah, which aligns with how the sacred tree in Virgil's Aeneid is found in the entrance to the underworld, since Khaenri'ah was a nation closest to the abyss. Except, earlier in this video, I equated the abyss with the heavens due to looking identical to space and the starry night sky. Then I went as far as to claim that Khaenri'ah was the kingdom established amongst the heavens, which Barbatos talks about when narrating the Gnostic chorus. Now, let me ask you this. What kind of race would you expect to find in the heavens? Angels. Angels are a heavenly race. And do you remember who the angels of Teyvat are? It is the dragons, because remember, John the Apostle was shown the great mother of prostitutes by one of the 7 angels who hold the 7 bows, and we already established that the 7 bows represent the 7 authorities, making the angel with John one of the 7 dragon sovereigns. To further support that, Neuvillette, who is one of the 7 dragon sovereigns, calls Nibelung the Heavenly Father, which is a title used in reference to God. And since we circled all the way back to the Whore of Babylon, I did say that the princess from the Gnostic chorus was the Night Mother, based on the fact that Barbatos calls her the Queen of the Kingdom of Darkness, which I correlated with Ereshkigal, the Babylonian goddess of the underworld, in addition to the fact that the Night Mother is inspired by the Whore of Babylon, who holds a golden cup and sits on a scarlet beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. So, since she was the heir to the kingdom established amongst the heavens, then the King of Kings, or should I say the Sovereign of Sovereigns, is her father, right? I think you know exactly where this is going now. You know what? How about I tell you a story about a princess named Fischl. Mondstadt's Fischl is a human girl named Amy who cosplays as the main character from Mr. Nine's novel Flowers for Princess Fischl. There are 3 things worth noting about Amy. The first is that she hails from Mondstadt, a nation directly inspired by Germany, and you're gonna see why that's important later. The second is that she has a raven named Oz, who acts as her knight and guardian. The third and most important thing to note about Amy is that her name, Ami, is amongst the 72 Ars Goetia demons of King Solomon, just like Morax, Boer, Hagentus, and Barbatos. And while Amy herself is not a demon, her name is likely supposed to nudge us in the right direction when it comes to the identity of the real Princess Fischl. Alright, now I'm going to go through Flowers for Princess Fischl with you, and we will analyze it step by step, and after we are done, you will understand everything I've been saying in this theory. Also, do note that I'll go over the important parts, we'll ignore the minor details. The book starts with a quote from Fischl's mother saying, "The dream lives on," and I am so sorry for starting like this, but we're gonna skip over that quote for now, because I'll talk about it in part 2 of this theory. Yes, there's gonna be a part 2 to this video, but don't worry, I promise you, it won't be as long as this one. It's gonna be like maximum 20 to 25 minutes long, surely Closcopian. Anyway, in that video, we'll discuss Kaya, Paimon, and Layla. For now, I want to stay focused on Irmin and his daughter. Adding the mother is way too much. Mr. 9 reveals the setting of the story to be the Immenachreich, which is German for the Kingdom of Eternal Night. And I think we can all agree that this is Khaenri'ah, since Khaenri'ah was, according to Albedo, an underground kingdom with no access to sunlight. However, the Immenachreich could also have a double meaning because the Night Mother is known as the Queen of the Kingdom of Darkness, and her kingdom is Teyvat. Mr. 9 then talks about Osvaldo Hrafnavins, who in this case is Dainsleif for two reasons. Osvaldo is the captain of the Night Ravens, and from Fischl's domain in the Golden Apple Archipelago, we know that the Night Ravens are the knights of the Immenachreich, which is Khaenri'ah, and Dainsleif is the captain of the Royal Guards of Khaenri'ah. The other reason is that Mr. 9 mentions how Osvaldo destroyed the Mirong, which means the Twilight, and Dainsleif is the Twilight Sword. Mr. 9 then makes a reference to how Nashtvorang, which in this case would either mean the Veil of Sin or the Night Sky itself, is the nemesis of Twilight. This line over here talks about how Dainsleif's men became cursed and turned into Black Serpent Knights, and now we get to the beast of the world, Gesamte Kunstwerk. Okay, the word Gesamte Kunstwerk means the complete work of art, a term coined by this man right here, Wilhelm Richard Wagner, who you might know as the author of the cycle of four Germanic operas that inspired Genshin Impact, collectively known as the Ring of Nibelung. And oh, get ready, baby. This is about to be fire. You see, Gesamte Kunstwerk, which means the complete artwork, sounds a lot like the great work of alchemy, also known as the magnum opus, which is Rubido, the red philosopher's stone. And remember, this is the power that appears around both Fischl and the black serpent that stole her father's pearl in the Gnostic chorus of the Battle Pass. Rubido is also the power of the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles, and if you take a close look at the Sustainer's cubes, you will notice the symbol of Quanta in the Hoyoverse, which can also be seen during the Traveler's fight against the star-devouring Narwhal. Now, do you remember earlier in the video how I told you that the parable of the tree carries a double meaning, where it simultaneously talks about the sacred Sakura tree and Irminsul? Well, watch out, because what I'm about to tell you also has a double meaning. Mr. 9 writes thusly: in a distant land, if the philosopher Zarathustra was not chosen, then the opera writer would have gained victory in the contest over the will of the world. Once Gesamte Kunstwerk takes the stage in the opera theater of the apocalypse, many more beasts of the world that reside within the center of the universe will inexorably begin to appear as well. What I just read sounds as if it was foreshadowing the events which unfold towards the end of Masquerade of the Guilty, when the Traveler and Neuvillette face off against the star-devouring Narwhal. And yes, it was foreshadowing that. However, it is also telling us about a great historical event that took place in the past. But before I tell you what that event is, let me point your attention to the Q&A section of Flowers for Princess Fischl, where one of the readers asks Mr. 9 about who would win in a fight between Mir's father, Khan the Asura, and his sword the Leviathan against Gesamte Kunstwerk, and Mr. 9 says that it would be Gesamte Kunstwerk. In case you didn't know, Mr. 9 is also the author of another book series known as the Legend of the Shattered Halberd, which you fully obtain after completing Sincho's first story quest. The Legend of the Shattered Halberd starts by stating that in the distant past, when the Axis Mundi was unobstructed, there were 9 realms, each a world of its own. But following a great calamity, the gods waged war against one another, and the God King fell, leading to the destruction of the 9 realms. The world was then reborn anew, and the Axis Mundi was sealed off. The story follows a military officer called Wei Yang and Mir, the son of a former minister of the imperial banquets at the imperial court, as they travel to gather the pieces of the God King's divine halberd. The duo embark on a long journey where they encounter many personal and political dilemmas. Eventually, it is revealed that Wei Yang is in truth the Celestial Emperor's daughter, possessing the body of a female military officer, and that her goal is to gather the pieces of the God King's divine halberd and reconstruct it. It is also worth noting that according to Mr. 9 himself, the Celestial Emperor's daughter is the direct equivalent of Fischl in this story. Soon after, an even bigger plot twist happens, where it is revealed that Mir's father is not in fact his father, but instead he was Khan the Asura from Jotunheim, and that he was once a good friend of the Celestial Emperor. Khan the Asura gives Mir a great sword known as Leviathan. In terms of mythological inspirations, Leviathan was a weapon crafted by Loki, who was a giant from Jotunheim, so that checks out. And it is said to be the only weapon in the world that is capable of killing the hawk that sits atop of Yggdrasil, Vidrfolnir. Remember, that's the visionary that Skirk talks about. Its name, Leviathan, also sounds a lot like the Leviathan, which gives it draconic connections, and you're gonna see why that's important in a couple of minutes. Regardless, Mir and Wei Yang face even greater challenges, after which they come across a warrior from the east, who reveals that the Celestial Emperor once went to war with the Asura. To prepare for the war, the Celestial Emperor selected soldiers from the three realms and made them ascend to become his celestial army after death. The warrior from the east held one of the ominous swords that make up the shattered halberd. Mir and Wei Yang engage in a grueling battle against the Celestial Emperor's warrior until Mir unleashes the true power of his father's sword, the Leviathan, which is revealed to have been the weapon that once burnt the 9 realms asunder during the War of the Gods. And now, unleashed once again, Wei Yang fell unconscious as she saw the 9 realms burning once more. A short while later, the Crown Prince of the Imperial Court goes to meet Mir. He then informs him that with the Axis Mundi unsealed once more, the Imperial government seeks to wage a new war against the Asura. The Crown Prince then asks Mir to hand over the Divine Halberd in exchange for the Prince taking good care of Wei Yang, who remember was a military officer possessed by the Celestial Emperor's daughter. That was the end of Volume 5, and now between Volume 5 and Volume 6, there is a passage which I want to read out to you. Mir once again chanted the forgotten spell. The maiden was reunited with him again. So this is what you truly look like, said Mir. The story then switches to a different scene. The world was beyond repair. It shall be born anew from the ashes of the last. The mad Celestial Emperor sentenced all living things of the world to hard punishment. But you would understand me, wouldn't you? The nameless thief who stole the national treasure said to his lord. No apologies needed, for you are benevolent. Okay, so Mir ends up reuniting with Fischl, while her crazed father sentences all life in the world to hard punishment. But what I want to point your attention to is the nameless thief who stole the national treasure. Here, I want you to remember that both the Legend of the Shattered Halberd and Flowers for Princess Fischl are written by Mr. 9. And when Mr. 9 writes about the beast of the world Gesamte Kunstwerk, remember what he said. In a distant causality, if the philosopher Zarathustra was not chosen, then the opera writer would have gained victory in the contest over the will of the world. Now remember that Gesamte Kunstwerk was a term coined by the opera writer Wilhelm Richard Wagner, the author of The Ring of Nibelung. And in Rheingold, the first cycle of the Ring of Nibelung, a dwarf named Albrecht steals a golden treasure from the 3 Rhine maidens, who in Genshin are the 3 Moon Sisters. Yeah, you thought I forgot about them, huh? You thought I forgot about the Moon Sisters, didn't you? You thought I forgot, huh? So the nameless thief in the Legend of the Shattered Halberd would be Albrecht, the servant of the Celestial Emperor who stole the national treasure from the Moon Sisters. Finally, in Volume 6, the God King is resurrected and he meets with his daughter Fischl, telling her, "O my daughter, the one in whom all my hopes are placed, did I not bring you into existence that you might one day pierce me with a halberd?" Mr. 9 then reveals the biggest plot twist in all of Genshin. He goes on to say that the first divine halberd, Irmin, once pierced the Axis Mundi and connected the 9 worlds. Now its replicas had proliferated across the heavens, and that fearing the madness that would ensue upon his death, the God King created one final divine halberd and named her Prinzessin de Verurtelong, Fischl, the Queen of the Kingdom of Darkness, the Night Mother, Ereshkigal, the whore of Babylon, whom John saw seated upon a scarlet red beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. However, the reason I told you about the Legend of the Shattered Halberd was not because of Fischl or Irmin. No. It was because of Mir's adoptive father, Khan the Asura, who comes from Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. You see, the term Asura originates from India, and it is used in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism in reference to a variety of divine beings or deities which can be either good or bad depending on the situation. Now, the most important thing that I want you to notice is that there are three main species in the Legend of the Shattered Halberd. There are the humans, the gods of the Celestial Emperor, and the Asura. And how convenient is it that in the Legend of Saha, the game made by Genshin Impact's lead producer, Tsai Yu, there are also three main species. There are the humans, the gods who used to be humans, and then there are the Asura. And in Genshin, we also have three primary species. We have the humans, and then the demon gods of Solomon's Ars Goetia, and then we have the dragons, who we already established are the angels of Genshin. Okay, the full name of Mir's father is Khan the Asura, and the word Khan is an honorific title popular across several countries in Asia, where it generally means something along the lines of leader or ruler or an Islamic sultan. Essentially, it is used to refer to someone of high status, like I'm sure most of you have heard of Genghis Khan, for example. This means that Khan the Asura is the king of the Asura. Now in Genshin, we already know who the humans are and who the gods are. Therefore, the Asura can only be the dragons, and the dragons of Genshin are equated with angels, while Nuvilat refers to the dragon king as the heavenly father, which means God, the king of the angels. Then Khan the Asura would logically be the high king of the dragons, Nibelung. Now, knowing what you know, let me take you back to where we left off in Flowers for Princess Fischl. The reader asks Mr. 9 who would win between Mir's father, Khan the Asura, and his sword Leviathan against Gesamtu Kunstwerk. But remember, just like the parable of the tree, this story also has a double meaning, and as Mr. 9 says, Gesamtu Kunstwerk appears in the opera theater of the apocalypse. This already happened when the all-devouring narwhal appeared in the opera Epiclese, and in that context, Khan the Asura would be Nuvilat, and his sword Leviathan would be the Traveler. Also, I want you to keep in mind something very important. The all-devouring narwhal is literally Tartalia's constellation, and when we talk to Skirk, she mentions how the narwhal chose Ajax because it saw something in him. However, we have a problem. Nuvilat and the Traveler end up defeating the all-devouring narwhal, while Mr. 9 says that Gesamtu Kunstwerk would be the winner against Khan the Asura. And here, I want to take you back once more to when Mr. 9 says, in a distant causality, if the philosopher Zarathustra was not chosen, then the opera writer would have gained victory in the contest over the will of the world. The opera writer refers to Wilhelm Richard Wagner, the author of the 4 opera cycles, The Ring of Nibelung. And since they are fighting over the will of the world, then the opera writer would be Nibelung himself, who is also Khan the Asura. And wait, I feel so stupid because I just realized this right now. And when I say right now, I mean right now as I am recording this. Zarathustra is freaking auto-apocalypse, holy shit! In case you didn't know, Zarathustra was the founder of Zoroastrianism, who was popularized through the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is referenced in Hoyoverse through the title of Honkai Impact 3's animated cutscene, Thus Spoke Apocalypse, where auto-apocalypse is equated with Zarathustra. And do you remember earlier how I said the star-devouring narwhal chose Ajax because it saw something in him? Well, Mr. 9 says that had the philosopher Zarathustra not been chosen, then Nibelung would have won over Gesamtu Kunstwerk in the battle for the will of the world. Oh my god, this explains why Rukkhadevata and Nahida look like Kalin and Teresa. By the way, guys, this is not scripted. I am actually losing my mind right now. Okay, in case you didn't know what I'm yapping about, in Honkai Impact 3rd, there is this really big family called Kaslana. And Otto is not a member of that family, but he is so connected to them to the point where you can consider him an honorary member of the Kaslana. Otto used to love a member of the Kaslana family named Kellen, you can see her right here, but he was never able to actually marry her. She eventually gets killed and Otto goes insane trying to find a way to bring her back or save her. He even creates a girl named Teresa, who is a clone of Kellen, and Nahida in Genshin is supposed to be Teresa's XP. So if Otto is Irmin, who planted Irminsul, while Teresa's XP Nahida is a copy of Rukkhadevata, Then that explains why Ruka Devata out of all the gods is the XP of Kalin Kaslana. You know what? Let us continue with the main video, you'll see what I mean. Mr. 9 writes that the enemy of Gesam Tukunsverk is the Saint of the Seven Tears, which is the Traveler who is a Descender. And Mr. 9 says that the Traveler's combat strength is 10 and therefore equal to Fischl. The point of this line is not to say that the Traveler and Fischl are identical in power, but rather to put them on equal standings. In other words, Mr. 9 is saying that Fischl, who is the Whore of Babylon, is on par with a Descender like the Traveler. Alright, to put the nail on the coffin so that we can finally move on from this topic because I'm really tired from it, Mr. 9 talks about the suspected eternal return, where he mentions how Fischl's father is undoubtedly not a mere shade. He is majestic and mighty and helps Fischl to dispel her confusions. Pay attention to how the author says Fischl's father helps her dispel her confusions, clearly written in a manner that implies an underlying sinister tone. And it is important to understand this distinction because fatherly love is generally portrayed as what we would call tough love, like teaching you valuable lessons, protecting you, and sometimes letting you learn things the hard way. But something about the way Fischl's father is portrayed sounds off. You know what? If you look at it from Fischl's perspective, it almost sounds like this. My father is the celestial emperor. He is so majestic and mighty and helps me dispel any doubt or confusion. I don't need to think for myself. I can always ask my father. Because my father is a god. My father knows everything. My father is always right. You see what I mean? It sounds very underhanded and snaky. And look, I could be reading into it way too much, but considering how delusional Amy is, I wouldn't be surprised if the real Fischl also got some of that stupid juice in her brain as well. Also, there is another reason. When the angel shows John the Apostle the Whore of Babylon, John sees her sitting on top of a scarlet beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And in plate 6 of Splendor Solace that inspires the parable of the tree, we established that the philosopher clothed in red is the counterpart to the king, due to the fact that red in alchemy is the color of the magnum opus, the philosopher's stone which can transmute base metals into gold and grant immortality. Okay, so Fischl is supposed to be the Babylonian goddess Ereshkigal, the queen of the night, while the Imenachreich is the empire of everlasting night. And notice what Flowers for Princess Fischl says about the emperor of the Imenachreich. Mr. 9 writes that Fischl's father is no mere shade. So Fischl's father is not just a shade, huh? In fact, I might even go as far as to say that her father is the king. And the king was the incarnation of the Primordial One. The first Descender, King Irmin, the first divine Halberd that pierced the veil of sin, shattering the Axis Mundi and united the 9 realms. Irmin is the king, and the king is the Primordial One. However, we still have a huge problem to deal with. We know for a fact that the Primordial One came from beyond Teyvat, while Irmin was a human king that lived a little over 500 years ago. So the question then becomes, how could Irmin be the first Descender if he was a mere human native to Teyvat? To answer that, allow me to redirect your attention back to the beast of the world, Gesam Tukunsverk. As I said earlier, Gesam Tukunsverk means the complete artwork, which can be interpreted as the great work or the magnum opus of alchemy. And just like how the tree from the parable of the tree can refer to both the sacred Sakura and Irminsul, the beast of the world Gesam Tukunsverk also refers to 2 different star beasts. The first and obvious one is the all-devouring narwhal that chose Ajax after he awakened something which it saw in him. When the readers ask Mr. 9 who would win between Khan the Asura, who is Nibelung, and his sword the Leviathan versus Gesam Tukunsverk, Yai Miko forces Mr. 9 to answer, after which he says that his money is on Gesam Tukunsverk. However, had the philosopher Zarathustra not been chosen, then Nibelung would have been the victor in the battle over the will of the world. And in the Hoyoverse, Zarathustra is correlated with Otto Apocalypse, a man infamous for dabbling with history and reality through altering the axis mundi of the Hoyoverse, the imaginary tree. Therefore, Irmin should be Genshin Impact's version of Otto Apocalypse. He is the red philosopher in the parable of the tree that achieved Rubidu, the philosopher's stone. After all, Irmin was a man who sought forbidden knowledge, and in his pursuit, he tore the veil of sin to obtain power from beyond. But that power found him first, and that power was an alien star beast that chose Zarathustra, that chose Irmin, and merged with him to become the magnum opus, the scarlet beast upon whom the great prostitute sits, to become the Primordial One. But according to the legend of the Shattered Halberd, the Primordial One did not fight the Asuras alone. It brought with it an army of celestial warriors, and together they invaded Teyvat, after which they challenged and defeated the dragon sovereigns and arrested their authorities. After this point, it becomes extremely hard to predict what's actually happening, so I'm gonna keep it real with y'all. I'm just gonna throw a bunch of random guesses on what took place, and like I said at the start of this video, my goal is to give you the information, because even if I am wrong, there is something to it. I suspect that when the Primordial One defeated Nibelung, the Usurper King likely used the authority of the Dender Dragon Apap to create Irminsul. Here, I want you to take a look at the Khaenri'ah chapter from the Teyvat Travails trailer. Do you see how, unlike any of the other chapters, the Khaenri'ah one has no number? Well, this is probably because the Khaenri'ah chapter is going to be taking places across several different points in time. Because remember, the king of Khaenri'ah, the kingdom that did not acknowledge any gods, is also the king of Celestia, the institution of the gods. People always wonder why the Genshin Impact timeline is so messy and convoluted, and I think that is done by design. Genshin's timeline is supposed to be like this. It is supposed to not make any sense because someone, most likely the king and his four shades, are screwing with the timeline on purpose. And we know from the stories of both Scaramouche and Beelzebul that there are multiple methods through which people can change history, in the case of Istaroth or Baal, or alter everyone's perception of history, like how Boer and Scaramouche did with Irminsul. So it is definitely not out of the question that Irmin used the authorities of both Nibelung and Apap to change the course of history, or to change how people remember history, or even a combination of both. You know what? I think it's a combination of both. Earlier, I mentioned the Khaenri'ah royal bloodline, and now is a perfect time to elaborate on the relevance to the topic. You see, Rubido is the color of the Philosopher's Stone, but it is also the color of blood. You know, like the crimson-red blood of Randaughter's creations, Duren and Elinas. We know that blood is an absolute requirement for human life. After all, Egeria was incapable of transforming the Oceanids of Fontaine into true humans, as she lacked the ability to give them vessels with real blood. And so she used concentrated water from the Primordial Sea as a substitute, and it wasn't until the end of the Arconquest, Masquerade of the Guilty, when Nivelette replaced the Primordial Seawater in their veins with true blood, that the Oceanids finally became true humans. And the one who was able to do it was not a god, it was a dragon, it was an angel. And speaking of angels, I did make the claim earlier that Khaenri'ah was a kingdom established amongst the heavens from the Gnostic chorus, due to its proximity with the divine starry sky. So, if Khaenri'ah is indeed a kingdom established in heaven, then what would its inhabitants be? You see, I don't believe that Khaenri'ahns are real human. Not quite. One of the biggest distinctive features of Khaenri'ahns is their ability to transform into abysslings, such as the Abyss Mages, Heralds, and Lectors, and so on, which almost no other human race on Teyvat is shown to be capable of replicating. And I say almost because there is one exception, Jacob Baker, who was a Fontainian Oceanid. What I'm about to say is not actually something new. I talked about it a long time ago in this video right here, about the Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies. And while I think there are some teeny tiny bits that are now a bit outdated, the majority of the video still holds up really well to this day. So I'm going to give you a very brief rundown of its major talking points. Shortly following the cataclysm of Khaenri'ah, the Fontainian reporter Karl Ingold took the Narzenkreuz Institute boys René de Petrichor and Jacob Baker with him on an expedition into the Vrokasha Oasis, where their god Egeria had recently departed the mortal realm. There, René remarked that the composition of both his body and Jacob's were similar to that of the Gaukrena lotus which housed Egeria's consciousness. Fast forward a couple of patches later, we discover that the reason that is the case is because the people of Fontaine were descendants of Egeria's Oceanids familiars, whom she transformed into human image. And since René says that Karl Ingold's body is unlike them, the latter was likely not a native Fontainian. During the expedition, Jacob almost died, after which René performed a procedure on him which turned him into an abyssling, an iniquitous Baptist to be specific, proving that Fontainians can become abysslings just like the Khaenri'ahns. And here I want to point out something interesting about the Oceanids, specifically regarding their creation. In the natural history excerpts, it is written that when Egeria shed the first tear, she dissolved the bones of a giant lizard from which swans, the Oceanids, were born. And I suspect that this lizard that Egeria dissolved was the carcass of the former Hydro Sovereign, who perished shortly after the war with the Primordial One. and Egeria herself is said to have had a heart with nobility akin to that of a dragon. Therefore, it is very likely that Egeria was the heart of the Hydro Dragon, while her Oceanid familiars were the rest of his body. At any rate, to cut the long story short, if the Oceanids are draconic in nature, then the Seelies, who look almost identical to them, should also be draconic as well. And that explains why everything leads back to dragons. We know that Nibelung is God, the Heavenly Father, which makes the 7 dragon sovereigns his archangels. Now we also know that the Seelies served the Moon Sisters, who were the equivalents of the Rhine Maidens in the Ring of Nibelung, from where the dwarf Albrecht stole a golden treasure to fashion the great magical ring. Just like the dragons, Seelies are also angelic in design. You can see explicit angel wings on their courts, and their design is inspired by a species of sea slugs known as sea angels. Additionally, we also know that Seelies built great palaces across Teyvat, and according to the scholars of the Academia, these Celtic ruins we find scattered across Teyvat are known as the ruins of Dahri, which is the Sumerian word for Khaenri'ah. Additionally, several dragons in Genshin such as Durin and Dvalin are named after dwarfs from Nordic and Germanic folklore, and Albrecht, the nameless thief who stole the Rheingold, was a dwarf. Finally, we also know that Seelies were cursed by heaven and forbidden to love. The only logical explanation to that would be if heaven itself wanted to cut their bloodline and end their lineage for some reason. And suddenly everything makes sense. Before Irmin became the Primordial One, the Khaenri'ahns used to be Seelies, a special kind of dragons or angels, if you want to call them that, who served the Moon Sisters. This explains why their eyes look similar to those of Nivelette. And someone, maybe the Pale Princess or the Night Mother or perhaps Irmin himself, transformed some of the Seelies into humans to save them from the curse. And this is where things start to get really messy, because from this point onwards, the real timeline and history manipulation shenanigans begin to hit, and it becomes very hard to see the full picture. But overall, this explains why Khaenri'ahn royalty value the purity of their bloodline so much. They want to preserve their ancestral connection to the Moon Sisters. Also, this tells us so many things. First, it explains why the Khaenri'ahns do not acknowledge the Gods of Celestia. It is because they know that the Gods of Celestia are a bunch of scammers, rats, and frauds who used to be humans just like them, exactly like the gods from the Legend of Saha. You remember that? This also explains why some of the gods like Morax, Amun, Remus, and Hagentis are said to have descended from heaven. They might very well be former Khaenri'ahns who became gods when Irmin obtained the Philosopher's Stone after merging with a star beast and became the magnum opus, the Primordial One. Also, this explains what is going on in this name card right here, where the Universitas Magistrorum are said to have served a guy called the Almighty Sovereign. Now, Almighty Sovereign definitely sounds like something you would call the Primordial One, especially given his interest with the 2 stars, which are obviously Aether and Lumine. However, I highly suspect that the Universitas Magistrorum was a Khaenri'ahn institution, because I have a feeling that Mona's master, Barbelith, was a member of that organization. And if they are indeed Khaenri'ahn, then why the heck would they serve the King of Celestia? Well, because like I said throughout this video, the King of Celestia is their king, Irmin. And to prove that, if you translate the Chinese version of the name card, Almighty Sovereign actually becomes Supreme King or Highest King. This also explains why Barbelith is named after one of the eons of the Gnostic monad. It is because Nibelung is the monad and Irmin is the demiurge. Irmin is the false god, Irmin is Lucifer. And that is why the gods of Teyvat are named after the demons of King Solomon. After all, devils are fallen angels who followed Lucifer in his pride. And if the Khaenri'ahns were once Seelies, who are dragons, who are angels, then they are fallen angels who rebelled against the Heavenly Father, Nibelung. Ah, man. Now, at its essence, Revelation 17 is a biblical commentary on how states and nations collapse and fall due to greed and corruption. The whore of Babylon is the state. She represents the image of material gain and worthless desires that lead into sin and meaningless divisions amongst the people. The 7-headed beast, which the prostitute sits on, represents the evil and corrupt figureheads of the nation, which the people do not notice because they are so busy looking at the whore herself. Now, in the biblical account, the whore of Babylon sits on the degenerate beast of the state, offering people hedonic pleasures and desires. But the story doesn't end there. You see, the angel that holds one of the 7 bowls tells John thus about the beast. The beast that you saw was thus, and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit. This matches the description of Nouvelette's character story, which states that the usurper is currently incapable of exacting his absolute authority on Teyvat, because the beast once was, but currently is not, and one day will return. And do you know what John and the angel see when the beast returns? The beast kills the prostitute who sits on top of him and eats her. So if the Scarlet Beast chose Zarathustra, who is Irmin, who is King Solomon that strayed from God and became the demiurge, Lucifer, then who might the Night Mother be? Well, what if I told you that out of the 72 Ars Goetia demons, the closest and most loyal to Lucifer is called Paimon? But that is a topic for part 2 of this video, because this one has been long enough. In part 2, I will finally be discussing Layla as I promised. When did I promise that Layla video again? Wait, 6 months ago? Oh, shit. Okay. Yeah, for those of you who have been waiting for 6 months, first of all, I'm sorry. Second of all, get ready, because, oh boy, do I have a lot to say about Layla. Alright, to close things off, I do want to make some quick clarifications. I know that I said the King of Kings from the Gnostic Chorus is Irmin, but since the Primordial One very likely changed history, it is also very hard to tell if the king is supposed to be Irmin or actually Nibelung, because this could very well be Nibelung, the monad, and Irmin simply manipulated history to make it look as if it was him. After all, Teyvat is the Primordial One's world, and we know only what the Primordial One wants us to know. At any rate, the prince at the end of the battle pass is very likely the 3rd descender. And from the Legend of the Shattered Halberd, we know that Khan the Asura, Nibelung, has a sword called Leviathan, which could set the 9 realms ablaze. And Dainsleif is called the Twilight Sword, which is taken from the 4th and final cycle of the Ring of Nibelung, known as the Twilight of the Gods. Speaking of the Ring of Nibelung, the Pari Zurvan says that she saw Dainsleif coming out of the Tunigi Hollow during the Cataclysm while clutching a ring to his chest, the Ring of Nibelung. So if Dainsleif is the son of Nibelung, the Heavenly Father, then Dainsleif would be Jesus, and the Fatui are trying to resurrect the 3rd descender, resurrect Jesus, which would make them the 12 apostles. This is very convenient because Piero is similar to Pierre, and Pierre is the French version of Peter, and Peter was the first disciple chosen by Jesus. This means that the Tsaritsa might have been a follower of the 3rd descender, probably Mary Magdalene, but I'll explain that in a different video. And this is why I think that the Apostle John is one of the harbingers in Genshin, probably Columbina, but you know what? He might be Tartaglia now that I think about it. Anyway, I have a lot of work to do, so thank you all for watching. I'm gonna go for now. I've been my name for now, and I will see you in the next time. For now.